All right, well, terrific. Well, thanks everybody. Just again, to make sure you're in the right place. So welcome to the webinar for the annual RFA for the creation of supportive housing, also known as the PSH RFA. This is the 2025 PSH RFA, and so we've made some changes for this year. We are mostly going to be talking about tenant-based vouchers. If we have time, we can talk a little bit about project-based vouchers that are available through the PSH RFA, but mostly we're really going to be focusing on tenant-based. The conversation on project-based vouchers through the PSH RFA, as well as a discussion of the 9% pilot, will be taking place next week on Wednesday the 27th from 1:45 p.m. to 3 p.m. So this is really, we're going to mostly talk about tenant-based vouchers. If you have questions about project-based, I know we have some of my colleagues from the Office of Housing Finance and Sustainability who have joined. They may be able to stay on, but really, if you've got detailed questions about the 9% pilot, the conversation on the 27th will be a great focus for that. Okay. All right, any questions or concerns before we get started? And I will go ahead and start screen sharing. Okay. So the PSH RFA went live on the Division of Housing website on Friday. So thank you everyone for your patience. We got it out on the 15th. And so there are 4 rounds of the PSH RFA. Before I start screen sharing, I'll just talk through this. So on each of those rounds, folks have the opportunity to apply for tenant-based vouchers. It's important to note that we only have 50 vouchers available, 50 tenant-based state housing vouchers that are currently available through the RFA. 50 total for all 4 rounds. So it is entirely possible that we may not have vouchers available on all 4 rounds of the PSH RFA. We are going to have them until they are done, basically, is how it's going to work. So let me pull up the PSH RFA, and we'll pull it straight from the Division of Housing website. And we'll get going here. All right, so let me screen share, and hopefully you'll be able to see this. All right, can I just get a quick thumbs up from folks if you can see these, my screen sharing? Great, thanks, Amanda. Okay, so there are 4 rounds. The LOIs for the first round are due December 13th. Applications are due February 4th. That application round is open to any of the tenant-based voucher applications. It's also available for non-competitive LIHTC, non-LIHTC, and the 9% tax credit round. So that is typically referred to as the 9% round. And I anticipate you will have folks who will apply for tenant-based vouchers on that round. You are welcome to do so. Given that there are only 50 vouchers total, tenant-based vouchers available, it may make sense for folks to go ahead and get that application in. What we are doing, as far as those application rounds go, we piloted this in 2024. We're going to build it on in 2025. And basically, if you are a tier 1 application, and what that means is you exceed supportive housing quality standards, and you're applying for tenant-based vouchers, and you get an early tier 1 designation, we will likely give you an award on the February 3rd round probably in March, in early mid-March. If you do not get a tier 1 designation and we still have vouchers available, we are going to go and bump you to the next round. So this is a little complex, so I'm going to talk it through slow. And folks, let me know if this doesn't totally make sense. So you come in, you apply on February 3rd, you got a great application. We think it looks great. We're going to put you in tier 1 status. You are at the top of the list. We got tenant-based vouchers. We're going to provide them up until they are no longer available. If we have a great application for 10 vouchers and a great application for 5 vouchers, and another great application for 10 vouchers, so we have 25 great applications for vouchers, and then we have an application for 10 and an application for 10 and an application for 5 that are not as good, that may be tier 1 or tier 2. We're going to kick those projects, those 25 vouchers that were tier 1 or tier 2, and they're going to go into the May 2nd round. And so we'll say, okay, everybody can come in and apply. If they didn't get a tier 1 designation and they want to rework their application, they can do so. And then we'll review everybody who comes in for that May 2nd round for the remaining tenant-based vouchers. This is we tried this with some of the ARPA resources, but we're going to give it a shot here with the tenant-based vouchers. This will also apply to non-tax credit and non-competitive tax credit applications, where you'll just get, if you're not tier 1, you'll get kicked forward. If you are a competitive tax credit application, if you're applying for 9% tax credits in February, and you can get a tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3. If you're tier 3, you will not be moving forward. We will not be making a conditional determination of vouchers. But if you don't get tier 1 or tier 2, and you're requesting 9%, then likely your project is dead in the water. You will not be moving forward. You cannot roll forward a competitive tax credit application from round to round. You can only do it for non-competitive tax credit, non-tax credit, and tenant-based voucher applications. Any questions so far on that? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and open up the PSH RFA and start to walk us through the new components. One thing to flag, you will notice the page count on the PSH RFA is much higher. That is only because of accessibility standards, so the spacing of the document is bigger. It is almost the exact same length from a original page counter perspective as it was last year, so don't let this page count be too daunting. Okay, so these are the 4 application rounds that I was talking about previously. For tenant-based applications, the relevant resources that we're going to be providing are, and you can see this on the eligible or funding availability. We have some great links in this. So, right, governing all of these projects and applications, you should have taken a look at the Making Homelessness Playbook. There are some relevant components on the supportive housing services landscape which relate to the new supportive housing provider type 89 provider, which some folks have requested. That is relating to Medicaid. And so we'll talk a little bit more about Medicaid, but there are some exciting things happening in the world of Medicaid where you can access the new supportive housing provider type, the type 89 provider, which may be relevant. You can only access that provider type if you already have supportive housing resources. So you cannot access the supportive housing provider type if you are not already doing supportive housing. We will review your request if you do receive resources through this PSH RFA. So let's say you're an organization, you haven't done supportive housing in the past, you're interested in doing it, you get a conditional determination, great. About 4 to 6 months prior to your project opening, in the case of project-based or in the case of tenant-based, just about right away, we'll go ahead, we'll let HICPUF know Agency X has got an allocation and they'll be able to access that supportive housing provider type moving forward. For the PSH RFA, for tenant-based vouchers, we are exclusively going to be allocating tenant-based state housing vouchers right here. So we are not allocating tenant-based housing choice vouchers. We are not allocating tenant-based VASH. Section 811 are exclusively project-based, things like that. And Host does not currently, from my understanding, does not have tenant-based rental assistance. Host is exclusively project-based. So that's the only thing we're allocating for. If you're applying for tenant-based vouchers, you're applying for tenant-based state housing vouchers. And that is something you'll want to make sure of when you're drafting your tenant selection plan, or in the case of tenant-based vouchers, your participant selection plan, is that you make sure you're planning for the eligibility requirements that come with the state housing voucher program. And that includes individuals need to be 18 years of age or older. They need to have some type of disabling condition. That is a different requirement than disability status, and they need to have a history of homelessness. And I know I've got some of my supportive housing team colleagues, Amanda and others on. If I miss anything related to the state housing voucher subsidy, feel free to jump in, but those are the main 3 that I always talk about, are age 18 years of age or older, disabling condition, history of homelessness. Okay, so we're not going to talk about the 9% pilot. that will really, that conversation next week on the 27th will really be focused on the 9% pilot. If we do have questions after we get through everything related to tenant-based, we can get into that. But again, really want to encourage folks, if you're applying for project-based vouchers, plan for the other webinar. Okay, so we just talked about the basically the rollover between rounds. So again, if you'll have the chance to recompete, but it becomes more competitive, right? So if you get a tier 2 or a tier 3 designation, or basically what it is, if you don't get a tier 1 designation, we're going to roll you into the next round and you'll recompete. So you're not out of luck if you don't get hear back on an award determination right away. But it will be more competitive because more folks will be coming in and the pot will be getting smaller. Okay, so we talked about supportive housing or state housing vouchers. These are tenant-based vouchers. As is the case with our project-based vouchers, your application will need to meet, the units where your tenant-based vouchers are utilized will need to meet housing quality standards, payment standards, rent reasonableness. So the value of a voucher, you are not actually getting an allocation of, say, $1 million, right? You will apply for and receive an allocation, as far as vouchers go, for between 5 and 50 vouchers. So, right, that's the size of your application. It needs to be between 5 and 50. And these are tenant-based vouchers, so they cannot be exclusively reserved for a single building. We've had folks attempt to do this in the past, but those are project-based vouchers. So if you're looking to put units with a permanent subsidy attached to that address, long-term, you would apply for project-based vouchers. Tenant-based vouchers are an allocation of vouchers that you as an organization are saying, basically, you have access to that allocation. But how you have access will be dictated by the tenant selection plan. So that tenant selection plan, or again, the participant selection plan, which is the tenant-based version of a tenant selection plan. A little bit funny. Tenant selection plan is for project-based. Participant selection plan is for tenant-based. Your participant selection plan will determine who gets access to those between 5 and 50 vouchers that you're applying for. But where those clients use their units are at their discretion. Typically, we encourage folks to select a specific geographic region. So, right, you need to indicate these vouchers will be for persons experiencing homelessness in Mesa County, or these 15 vouchers will be for folks in Huerfano, Los Animas. Okay, so those are the sort of parameters you'll need to select in order to utilize these tenant-based vouchers. Again, I know I'm just talking and talking. Any questions before I move on here? Okay, great. So talked about, I'm going to skim over the pilot. What you will need to do as a component of applying for both tenant-based and project-based vouchers is you will need to meet Division of Housing's supportive housing service standards. And what that means is that clients have access to at least a 15-to-1 client to case management ratio, and that you have tenancy support services at $7,200 per household per year. I'll show an example of that in just a second, but it's also important to note that you're only able to access 5 years of tenancy support services funding. So the two major resources for tenant-based applicants are tenant-based vouchers and tenancy support services. So you can apply for tenancy support services funding, and that is a grant agreement, and that does have a dollar amount attached to it. Right, so let's say you were applying for a supportive housing program for 10 persons. You can apply for half of the 7,200, which is right, 3,600. So if you're applying for 3,600 for 10 people, the quick math of that, right, gets you have a $36,000 tenancy support services contract. In total, you will need to be able to show that those clients have access to $72,000 in supportive services annually. From the Division of Housing PSS funding, as well as other funding sources like philanthropy, like you're leveraging a existing grant program that you have that's eligible to serve that population. We know that math is tricky. hopefully, right, also, you'll be able to leverage Medicaid. And so that may be a conversation with that new supportive housing benefit is, all right, we've had conversations with our regional accountable entity based on the new supportive housing provider type. We think we're going to be able to build this much in Medicaid for these 10 clients. And so we've built X amount of Medicaid into our supportive service budget. Those are the type of funding sources that we're really looking for. But again, at minimum, it needs to be $7,200 per household per year. And tenancy support services is only available for 5 years. So we're asking you typically to show a 15-year budget. That tenancy support services is only available years 1 through 5. Years 5 through 15, you're going to need to come up, show Division of Housing how you're going to pay for supportive housing services long term. Hopefully, right, we have exciting things in the work, like Colorado has submitted our 1115 waiver. That may mean right in year 2, the amount of Medicaid you'll be able to reimburse for will increase. But we really want to just see a budget grounded in reality to as close as is possible, knowing that 15 years is a long time. A lot can happen in 15 years, but that you and your organization has a realistic and solid plan for how you will ensure that the clients you're serving have access to high quality supportive services delivered in conjunction with the best practices of supportive housing, which are trauma-informed care, harm reduction, motivational interviewing, etc. Okay. Any questions on the vouchers or the tenancy support services funding that we make available? And again, for tenant-based vouchers, this is going to look a lot like it did in 2024. We are not making major changes for 2025 as far as tenant-based vouchers go. Again, biggest thing to look at is that supportive services landscape. That'll talk about this Type 89 provider and what's on deck with the potential 1115. You can see examples of eligible TSS expenses or tenancy support services expenses on things like, right, paying for inreach and outreach, paying for case management. The goal is that tenancy support services can pay for things that Medicaid can't pay for, are difficult to pay for, that can't be reimbursed through other costs. If you do receive tenancy support services funding, that funding will be provided on a reimbursement basis. So you will show Amanda and her team, right, expenses that are eligible for that $36,000 you receive for your 10-person permanent supportive housing program, and you'll request reimbursement from Division of Housing on either typically on a monthly or quarterly basis. Okay, the federal compliance is not applicable to tenant-based vouchers as it relates to these are state vouchers, so they do not trigger federal compliance. They're also not project-based, so typically you don't need to spend too much time on them, but the resources are very competitive this year. We know we have folks who we anticipate that those 50 vouchers will go quickly. So just to be aware of, but really we also have a hard cap on the amount of gap financing that's available through the 9% pilot that we'll be talking about more next week. Okay, I know it's very exciting to watch me scroll through a RFA you've likely already looked at. The unit mix, again, not applicable on the tenant-based voucher side, right? You are relying on private landlords, property owners, etc., who are willing to accept a tenant-based voucher. So there is not a unit already identified. You also cannot designate these units to a specific property. But what you can do is, right, you may have worked out a relationship with a property management firm or organization to say, hey, when we have a client who has a tenant-based voucher, we're going to say, hey, this property manager has units that they are flexible on criminal screening criteria, et cetera, but you cannot push someone to a specific unit. They have to have client choice. So that's why we're really caution folks, do not plan that you're going to make the financing for an affordable housing project work because you're going to apply for these tenant-based vouchers, because John Smith, when they may get a voucher, right, when they get a voucher, they may say, well, I don't want to live there. I was mugged on that corner, or some of my compatriots who I was formerly involved with in certain activities live right over there. I can't live over there. So those are the sort of things that we want to keep in mind anytime you've got tenant-based vouchers, is they are not associated with a specific property. And they really should not be, because that client choice component is so essential. And you got to walk that line too. If you have relationships with property management firms who've identified units, it's all about client choice, and the client can always say no. You cannot impose that client must live there at that unit if they have a tenant-based voucher. Okay. I'm going to keep scrolling through here. We're going to ask questions about service capacity and experience of the relevant best practices. So, right, does your organization have experience in serving persons experiencing homelessness? And right, the intention of this RFA, because it does subscribe to the supportive housing program model, is to serve persons who would otherwise who are the least likely to self-resolve their homelessness. So these are folks with complex barriers to housing stability who have not been able to self-resolve their homelessness. Folks experiencing long lengths of homelessness, complex barriers to housing stability, they may self-resolve their homelessness, but typically they're the least likely. They have the greatest barriers to doing so. And this resource is really intended to serve that population. And we know that it is a best practice. We also know that these rental subsidies are very valuable, right? Folks will describe getting a voucher like winning the lottery. So we are making sure through this RFA that the folks who get connected with one of these vouchers are the folks who really need that non-time limited rental subsidy. These are folks who may struggle, who will struggle to secure these units without a voucher because they are so low income. And that's another component to be aware of. I should have mentioned is that, right, in order to get a tenant-based voucher, you need to be income qualified for the state housing voucher program, which requires that you be at 30% area median income or below. So in order to get a state housing voucher, you have to meet all of those eligibility requirements. And then even more so, you're going to have your referral will have to go through that participant selection plan. Okay, we talked about the supportive services standards. Safety planning does not apply to tenant-based vouchers typically, right? You can't, that's more in the built environment, talking about trauma-informed care, things like that. If you are accepting tenancy support services, you will need to be entering funding into the Homeless Management Information System, or HMIS. And you will need to meet Division of Housing's performance standards, which are available in this document. That relates to things like our 80% annual housing stability rate, right? The hope is, again, the major focus of supportive housing is to keep high acuity clients in safe, stable housing. And so that housing stability rate is a key indicator of performance of your supportive housing program, your ability to keep folks who would otherwise typically not be successful in market rate housing, to keep them in a housing through the availability of those supportive services. So you're going to not just, we're going to find clients who have evictions, have histories of homelessness, and we're going to keep them in those units. Yeah, Michelle, go ahead.
Is there any advantage to or disadvantage to applying for the tenancy supportive services? Like, does that elevate your application? Are you looking for people who are applying for both, or
great question?
Did you apply for vouchers with none?
Yes, great question. So yes, so you can apply for tenant-based vouchers without applying for tenancy support services. That is absolutely something that can be done. And I will say the tenancy support services funding is more competitive typically than the vouchers, right? We've got 50 vouchers set aside. We have roughly, we don't have an exact dollar amount, but around 1,500,000 in tenancy support services available across both project-based and tenant-based. So applying for limited tenancy support services funding will likely, right, you are not applying for as precious of a resource there. And I will also say, Division of Housing's intention in tenancy support services funding is to provide a gap filler. That is funding that closes the gap that gets you to 7,200. Our hope, because we know we're not providing all of it, is that through Medicaid, through other funding sources, we want you to leverage as much supportive services funding as possible. So really appreciate that question. And yes, not applying for tenancy support services is likely to make your application more competitive. But at the same time, we also know there are great population, there's great need that exists, that there just isn't supportive services funding out there to serve that population. You cannot leverage, you know, an existing program of some kind if you're serving a very specific target population. So I'll give another great example, right? We had a really great application from Boulder Shelter for the Homeless, now All Roads, a few years ago, that did not require any tenancy support services funding because they were able to get tenancy support services funding from the county and the city. And so they just needed the vouchers from us. And that was a very competitive application because they only needed the rental assistance. And because of that also, they were not responsible for entering clients in meeting our HMIS performance standards, because those only occur when you have tenancy support services. We still want to see HMIS reporting, but that is only for our TSS programs, which do have, I will brag, a 94% housing stability rate. And we're really proud of that rate, but just something to be aware of there. Awesome. Okay, any more questions at this time? All right. Oh, yeah, go ahead. I have a hand from Lynn and Rob. And
sorry, I did not know Google Meet very well, and I never even figured out how to change my name. This is Lynn Thayer from
sorry,
How
Lynn.
you do it? Any hints would be helpful. But anyhow, I just am wondering, can these be used for someone who's been in another permanent supportive housing, not our Greyhound, but one of our others, to help to step them out of our program into a more community-based type of a program?
Great question. Yeah, I think that is a little bit of a tricky one, right? There is, the one home coordinated entry system has an alternative process, right? Clients who are in permanent supportive housing are able to retain their chronic homeless status to be able to move from one supportive housing program to another. But so I think it is eligible. You could apply for tenant-based vouchers in order to move clients out of a supportive housing program or an existing program. What we cannot do is move clients from out of a transitional housing program into a permanent supportive housing program. And I know that's not your question, Lynn, but if there are folks who are on the line who are curious about that, right? Because the supportive housing program model really is designed to serve folks experiencing homelessness, and it has a low barrier approach. We don't want to create that you must go through a transitional housing program or recovery residence program, et cetera, in order to get into a supportive housing program. So I think it would be eligible to apply for tenant-based vouchers in order to move clients out of a supportive housing program. But I will say, those applicants, right, may not be as competitive as folks creating new permanent supportive housing, because that is a requirement. So yes, you are creating permanent supportive housing, and yes, it would be an eligible use, but it just may be challenging, right, because we don't want folks to have to go through certain eligibility screening criteria would need to line up there. So ultimately, I think the answer would be yes, Lynn,
Okay,
and I appreciate that question.
Thank you.
Terrific. Any other questions? All right. And I know this is a long PSH RFA. The other thing I want to make sure we talk about is voucher administration. So you need to have a tenant selection plan or a participant selection plan. You're going to have a supportive service budget and plan, which goes through that $7,200 per household per year for 15 years. And you need to have a voucher administrator. A voucher administrating agency. So for the uninitiated, voucher administrating agencies play an essential role in supportive housing programs. They are the organizations that are doing the key compliance work around ensuring that clients are eligible to participate in the subsidy program, the state housing voucher subsidy in this case, right? So they're ensuring that clients, right, have that disabling condition verification, history of homelessness verification are at 30% AMI or below. They're also, right, briefing clients so they understand the parameters of how their voucher works, that there are things like payment standards, et cetera, that the voucher needs to, that that the unit needs to meet in order for a voucher to be utilized there. They're doing typically the inspection for those tenant-based unit, and then they're doing that long-term compliance on if an individual is added to a household, recalculating the household income, things like that. So the voucher administration agency is very, very important. One thing that we did in 2023 or 2024 that we're continuing to do is we have a list of DOH voucher administrating agencies listed or linked in the RFA. Applicants will indicate which agency they are planning to work with. We will then vet that request because voucher administration capacity changes all the time. We may have an organization that was doing really well, but maybe they are not doing their annuals on time, or they are really struggling to process applications. And so we'll say, actually, that entity is not approved. Please select another DOH voucher administrating agency, because just because someone is one of our current voucher administrators does not mean that they are approved to administer vouchers through the PSH RFA. So we, as part of the LOI process or letter of intent process, we will look at your request for who you have selected as voucher administrator, and then we'll say no. And then very quickly, we will try to give you that news as quickly as possible to say, okay, that entity is not approved. You need a different entity. And so it's a little bit complicated, but the intention there is to ensure that you do not end up with a voucher administrator who does not have the capacity to do that. And this is typically more relevant in terms of project-based vouchers because, right, there's a specific set of units in a particular building. With tenant-based vouchers, again, they're more complex. So we're looking to really vet that request for who your voucher administrator is. Part of that also goes to, we've hopefully in recent years, we have expanded the number of voucher administrating agencies. So there's more folks to look at, but we are really increasing and raising the bar as part of this larger competitiveness. We want to ensure that you have a voucher administrator who understands the program model, has relevant experience, and most importantly, has the capacity to administer the number of vouchers that you're requesting. Okay. Any questions about voucher administration that folks have? All right. So again, this goes to the DOH voucher administrator. Payment standards. This is a link to the section of Division of Housing's payment standards, right? A voucher is worth different amounts depending on where you are in the state and how big the household in question is when we're talking about tenant-based vouchers. So, right, a 2-bedroom unit in Montrose is worth a different amount than a 1-bedroom unit in Boulder. You, as tenant-based applicants, will not request a specific allocation or a configuration of vouchers. You will just request between 5 and 50. You will not, if you're applying for tenant-based, you don't need to say we're applying for 2 1-bedrooms and 3 4-bedrooms, etc. Right? That would be a concern from a fair housing perspective if you were to do that. Instead, what we want you to do is have that participant selection plan, and whoever is prioritized, whatever their household size is, the voucher that you have will align with that. So, right, if you have a household who is prioritized through your participant selection plan, and they need a 2-bedroom unit, that will be the voucher that they'll be issued. They'll be issued a 2-bedroom voucher that they will look for that aligns with the 2-bedroom in the community. So those payment standards are really only relevant once you get a client leased up when we're talking about tenant-based. If you're applying for project-based, obviously that would not be the case because you are applying for a specific building that includes a specific number of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-bedroom units. Also relevant, tenant-based vouchers, depending on where you are, we may have small area FMR or small area fair market rents that apply. So something that's, I think we have FMRs in El Paso County that vary by zip code. In most of the state, we just have a payment standard for the county, and it's the same in the county. It's just those specific municipalities that have that variance. Okay. Here's something that is relevant. Justice involved person. So we are very fortunate in Colorado. We are working with the Harvard Kennedy School's Government Performance Lab, GPL. And so if you are planning to serve persons with justice system involvement, we are encouraging folks to engage with GPL. They are partnering with the state of Colorado on the Homelessness Prevention and Rehousing Accelerator effort. And so they have some technical expertise and some valuable insights they can provide. And we're working with them really on right, where within the sequential intercept model your target population fits, and then what the best way to screen for and have a participant selection plan that aligns with that. That segues us very nicely into a conversation about tenant selection plans or participant selection plans. And I will use the two terms interchangeably, and I apologize, but participant selection plans are the documents that dictate how individuals are referred for your supportive housing. And so we have, I'm going to scroll up to the top, and this is a great way to use this document. You can see on the table of contents, the tenant selection plan templates. And if you click on that, it will open up a new page. So I'll stop presenting and I'll start presenting in just a second here. Okay, so this is the appendix for tenant selection plans that covers the different types of tenant selection plans that we make available through the PSH RFA. What you want to be doing if you're applying for tenant-based state housing vouchers is look at the appendix 4C for tenant-based state housing vouchers. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and then reshare that one. Okay. So this is the template document that you will use if you're applying for tenant-based state housing vouchers. And again, there are 4 sections of this document. Eligibility criteria, we've talked about that. Age 18 or older, extremely low income, disabling condition, history of homelessness. There's also student eligibility. It's just something to be aware of around the specific parameters when serving college students. What we do at the state housing voucher program is we mirror the housing choice voucher program's eligibility requirement around student eligibility. So something to be aware of there. Typically not relevant for this target population, but it does come up. Okay, so you can select so there are 4 components, right? Eligibility, referral sources, preferences, and then criminal screening criteria. Criminal screening criteria is not included in this document because it's a state housing voucher subsidy, and that it does not include a criminal screening criteria component. Since you are applying for tenant-based vouchers, folks really should plan, unless you have a very clear reason why, you should not be including criminal screening criteria for your tenant-based voucher program, because since you're relying on the private market, those landlords are already going to do their individual criminal screening criteria as well. So it typically does not make sense to impose 2 levels of criminal screening criteria, given that individual landlords are going to do that anyway. So talked about the eligibility criteria. Let's talk about referral sources. We have what we refer to as the 50-50 split compromise, where a minimum of 50% of your referrals must come through the regional coordinated entry system. And not must, we recommend 50% coming through the regional coordinated entry system. And then 50% can come from a DOH approved referral process. Now, let's say you are planning to serve young persons coming out of the child welfare system, right? Those households are not connected with coordinated entry. So you would have a reason to request for all of your referrals to come from the child welfare system, for example, or Department of Corrections. So we just say we want to see where we can referrals come from coordinated entry. And then if it's not reasonable, given that the population doesn't have access, we want to understand why that is. And then the preferences, right? This is how, of the folks you get, how if you have 10 clients and only 5 spots available, how will you prioritize who gets matched with a resource? So you could do things like including a formal disability preference, individuals with long lists of homelessness, individuals with high utilization of publicly funded systems as determined by Medicaid utilization, for example. So those are the sort of tiebreakers that you would approach and include if necessary. If you're taking 100% of referrals from coordinated entry, Your referrals through coordinated entry do not include preferences because coordinated entry has its own preferences that it's already using. So preferences really only apply to non-coordinated entry system referrals. If you're taking referrals in partnership with the justice system and you're talking to the data performance lab or government performance lab, right? Those referrals would have preferences. If you're taking 100% of referrals in coordinated entry, it doesn't make sense to include preferences. Okay. I have talked a lot about preferences, but we've talked about the key document around participant selection plan, supportive service plan and budget, having a voucher administrator. I want to go ahead and pause and really just sort of open it up to questions. I'm going to go ahead and stop presenting. We'll do recorded questions for the first 10 minutes. And then if folks want to have non-recorded questions, because you have a question you're embarrassed to include in the recording, that's totally okay. And I'll stop the recording. But for now, I'm going to stop presenting and we'll just leave it open for questions. Wanda, go ahead.
So I might have missed this. I had to run to the restroom real quick. How many of the vouchers are we able to apply for? Maybe that's not a question. Maybe I don't need to know that, but maybe.
No, great question. So if you're applying for tenant-based vouchers, the total number of tenant-based vouchers available through this RFA is only 50. And that's the maximum that one person could apply for. So somebody could go in and try to grab all 50. It would have to be a really, really good application because it would essentially end the availability of tenant-based vouchers for anybody else. And one neat thing that we can do is we have a voucher tracker. So if you open up the PSH RFA at the very top, there's a little document called voucher availability. And so I'll drop a link to that in the chat here. And so the voucher tracker document shows you how many tenant-based vouchers are available, how many project-based vouchers are available total through the RFA. So round one happens, we get a tier 1 application for 15 vouchers. All of a sudden, right, the amount of available vouchers will drop by a corresponding 15 vouchers. So all of a sudden, right, we're at 35 remaining tenant-based vouchers. And that may be relevant, right, of deciding whether folks want to reapply or not. If they say, well, wait a minute, there's only 35 vouchers left. We had an application for 45 vouchers. We're not going to go ahead and rework our application because we know we've been bumped to the next round. Did that answer your question, Wanda? Great. Okay. Other questions that folks have about tenant-based vouchers through the PSH RFA? Okay, I will go ahead and stop the recording so we can get any non-recorded questions.